Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Okay, that was an awesome kind of setup for what I want to talk about today. So I love to give talks in rooms like this full of coffee people. I love to be in rooms like this full of coffee people. But whenever I'm in a room that's filled with coffee people, at some point I know I will hear this sentence. It's become sort of a mantra for many of us in coffee. We say, well, it's what's in the cup that matters, isn't it? And I've always believed that to be true, because this is the way that we distill or express our reverence for flavor. Flavor is important to us, and flavor exists within the cup. And so to express that to each other, we say, well, it's what's in the cup that matters. It's flavor that matters. Now, for years, I've been in places like this, on stages like this, talking about this concept, exploring all the magical flavors that coffee has, developing tools for us to express those flavors and understand them and to measure them. So I'm on board with the flavor is important concept. But a few years ago, I started to ask myself, is it the only thing that matters? When we say it's what's in the cup that matters, are we saying that that's the only thing that matters? And I started to challenge myself on that idea. And what I'm going to do today is walk you through how I've changed my own views on this and why. Because I've developed the feeling and the commitment to the idea that it is true that what's in the cup matters, but also the cup matters, and what's around the cup matters. And what you know about the coffee also matters, what you expect about the coffee matters, and what you care about matters. And this affects our experience of coffee in some very significant ways. So to explain this idea, I want to touch on some of the words that Jen mentioned a minute ago, which is this idea of attributes. So we've been working with this concept over the last couple of years that sees coffee as a collection of attributes. I like to say a constellation of attributes, which looks, a constellation looks a lot like some of the shapes that Jen was showing us, right? Again, arranged in a circle, I guess that's what we do. But the intrinsic attributes are those attributes that we find in the cup. When we say it's what's in the cup that matters, we're talking about intrinsic attributes, especially flavor. But coffee has extrinsic attributes too. All those things that exist that aren't flavor, but are properties of the coffee, but are outside the coffee itself, we think of as extrinsic attributes. And that dichotomy between intrinsic and extrinsic attributes is key to this talk and the next couple of talks. And what I'm going to try to convince you of today is that these extrinsic attributes are not only important, they're powerful. So the first illustration of this, I'm going to go to soft drinks. Jim talked a little bit about soft drinks yesterday. We're going to talk some more about soft drinks. These are two probably very familiar products to most of you. I would guess that many of you have a preference between these two products. Most people do, and that's just the way the world is. But here's something that's interesting. Once you pour them in a glass and start to do taste tests with consumers, their preferences aren't so strong anymore. And in fact, consumers may prefer one over the other, they may not, but about half of the people prefer one of these colas, and about half of the people prefer the other. But once you start introducing brand information, suddenly preferences shift, and people start to prefer one over the other. This is called the Pepsi paradox, because absent brand information, people don't have strong preferences about cola. But once you introduce brand information, suddenly people start to prefer Coca-Cola by a significant margin. Now, researchers have known about this for quite a while, and they've been looking for an explanation. And the most convincing explanation that they've found so far has come through neuroscience. when they do brain scans of people in these two conditions, right, tasting things blind versus tasting things with brand information, they can see the brain operating in very different ways. When you taste something without much information, the orbitofrontal cortex is stimulated. You see activity in that part of the brain. However, suddenly when you introduce brand information, in this case, the Coca-Cola brand, suddenly different parts of your brain start to engage. And these are the parts of your brain that are associated with memory or feeling, that thing that develops our human experience. So suddenly we're engaging more of our brain, we're engaging more of our life experience, and it turns out, as we'll hear later, that it actually affects the way that we perceive things with our senses. Now, that's soda pop, Peter, you might say, and I agree. So we should look at other foods too, particularly specialty foods. So this is a picture of Serrano ham, and I've learned that there's a very special kind of Serrano ham called jamón de Teruel, which is sort of the pinnacle of jamón de Serrano from Spain. And they wanted to do some investigation about the intrinsic and extrinsic attributes of this kind of ham and see how they affected consumer behavior. And just as we would expect, intrinsic attributes, like flavor and texture, had a positive impact on people's purchase intent. When they tasted something that they liked, it motivated them to purchase it. No surprises there, right? That's sort of the basic bargain of specialty foods. But what they found is that when they started to look at those extrinsic attributes of the ham, that is stories about how it's produced and what its history was and where it came from, these attributes had a positive and significant impact on loyalty. That is, whether the consumers would purchase it again. So though taste might motivate them to buy the ham for the first time, the thing that kept them buying it over time was not the flavor necessarily. It was parts of the story of the ham. It's a very interesting study. But what about coffee, you might say? You know, does this apply to coffee? So I'm going to tell you about a study that was done actually here in the city of Boston a few years ago, where they were looking at this extrinsic attribute. It's fair trade certification. They wanted to know whether the existence of an extrinsic attribute like fair trade had an effect on people's perception or the way that they valued the coffee. And what they did is they went to a coffee shop. They took over a coffee shop actually for this study, which was very cool. And they had the same coffee. They were serving the same coffee to everybody, but sometimes they would present it to consumers without any information, and other times they would present it with information that it was fair trade coffee. And what they found that in this real life setting, the consumers were not as price sensitive as they had been. And they were willing to pay more for the same coffee just with the label of fair trade. Now this may not be surprising. We sort of operate under this assumption all the time. But this was a quantitative economic analysis of this phenomenon. And it's real and it happens. When people are offered more extrinsic information that resonates with them, they're willing to pay more, and they value the experience more. And they show it in studies like this one. So with this in mind, I feel like we're called upon to understand what these extrinsic attributes are in coffee and what consumers seem to value most. So for that, I looked at two studies. The first was called the Specialty Coffee Consumer Study, which the SCA did a few years ago, where we reached out to consumers and asked them a bunch of questions about coffee. And the second was the National Coffee Association Coffee Data Trends Study. And we've started working lately, last couple of years with the NCA, to develop a specialty coffee report that really focuses on specialty coffee. And you'll get both of these reports at the end of the conference. But let me summarize some of these attributes for you in these two studies. So if you look at the top 5 extrinsic attributes that consumers told us about in the SCA Specialty Coffee Consumer Study, it's these. And if you look at the top 5 extrinsic attributes from the NCA study, it's these. So I'm going to walk you through these a little bit. If you look at them, you'll start to see that there's some groupings here. Right at the top you see the word roasting a lot. In fact, the number one motivator for consumers in both studies was the roast level of the coffee, if they had information about the roast level of the coffee. Also in the NCA study, the concept of freshly roasted seemed to be a big motivator. Then there's a second group. The second group is, I call it the sustainability group. It talks about organic practices, sustainable practices, the concept of sustainability. The third group, I call the fair group. This is speaking to the concept of fairness, whether farm workers were treated well, et cetera. And then finally, the fourth group has to do with the origin of coffee, where it comes from. So let's walk through these concepts a little bit. The first is roast. Now you might ask yourself, wait a second, Peter. I was with you on that distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic. Isn't roast something intrinsic to the coffee? And that's true. Roasting creates chemical differences in coffee. A dark roasted coffee is materially different from a light roasted coffee, and in that sense, it's intrinsic to the coffee. But roasting is also a process, and there's cultural information that it communicates. So for example, we might talk about a French roast or an Italian roast. That's something cultural and informational about it. And roasting itself and freshness is kind of conceptual. So we can think about it as an extrinsic attribute as well. Now, in the Specialty Coffee Consumer Study, which was done in 2017, we found that in terms of roast color preferences, about 7% of people in our study said they preferred light roasted coffee, 60% said they preferred medium roasted coffee, and 33% said they preferred dark roasted coffee. In the more recent NCA study, the numbers are a little bit different. 28% said they preferred light roasted coffee, 44% said they preferred medium roasted coffee, and 34% said that they preferred dark roasted coffee. Now, my point here isn't to communicate these specific numbers, right? My point is to communicate that these are consumers that are diverse. These are people that are buying coffee, that like coffee, and you can see they're almost evenly divided into different kinds of roasting that they like. And if you pair that with the knowledge that roasting motivates people, in fact, 50% of people, the highest number in the study, said that they were more likely to buy a coffee if they knew it was freshly roasted. So roasting is important, it motivates people, and also people are diverse in their preferences about roasting. So what about this next category, sustainable practices? This is a term that we throw around a lot, we talk about it a lot, it's important to us, and it turns out it's important to consumers too. This was fascinating to me. 22% of people in the Specialty Coffee Consumer Study said that of all the ways that coffees are described, it was the sustainability description that resonated most over all of the other terms and ways that we use to describe. So that's not the biggest group of consumers, we'll see that later, but this is 22%, about a quarter of total consumers are really focused on the sustainability description, and that's what's meaningful to them. In the NCA study, 46% of people said that their decisions were they made their decisions in part because they wanted a coffee that was grown in a sustainable way. And that made them more likely to buy a coffee, choose a coffee for that reason. Now let's connect to this idea of fairness that I mentioned before. Another concept, right, that can be attributed to coffee. 16% of the people in the Specialty Coffee Consumer Study said that they had a preference for fair trade coffee. That's not an insignificant number. 53% of people in the NCA study said that they were more likely to buy a coffee if they knew it paid a fair price to the farmer. That's a big number. Over half the consumers said that. And 49% said they were more likely to buy a coffee if they knew that farm workers were treated well. And that's interesting. I think I heard yesterday some people talking about the farm workers' welfare being something that doesn't get talked about enough. And it's interesting that consumers seem to be motivated to care about it and to know about it. And they may very well respond to information about it when they learn about their coffee. Finally, I want to talk about the concept of origin, which is very near and dear to the specialty coffee community. Origin is important to us. Remember I talked before about this idea of resonating most, a group of consumers for whom the part of the description was the one that resonated most. For 27% of consumers, the largest group in this study, on this question, it was the identity of origin that resonated most with them. In other words, when they looked at a description of coffee, it was the description of origin that was most important to them. 27%, that's a pretty big number. And then this actually fascinates me. In the NCA study, they asked people, well, what's your impression of these coffee-producing countries? And look at these numbers. 96% of people had a positive impression of Colombia as a coffee-producing country. 95% of people had a positive impression of Brazil. And in fact, they go through a long list of coffee-producing countries, and in every case, consumers had an overwhelmingly positive impression of these countries as coffee-producing countries, which suggests that the existence of knowing that the coffee has an origin and it comes from one of these countries that they have positive associations with will add interest and value and experience to the coffee. So now let's get back to this cup. I hope that you, like me, can now see the cup rather than a vessel that's only there to hold this magical liquid that is the only thing we care about, and instead see coffee as a constellation of things that are special. The flavor indeed is special, but also the place it comes from helps make it special. Any practices like sustainable or fair practices, or knowing the roast level or the fact that it's freshly roasted, these things for a consumer act together and amplify the experience of what specialty coffee is. And by taking hold of these attributes and by manipulating them and understanding them better and communicating them better, we can increase the value of specialty coffee, we can increase the enjoyment of specialty coffee, and together we can make coffee better. Thank you.